Some children slip through the cracks so quietly that the world forgets they ever existed. But love has a way of finding the lost, even when hope seems impossible. On a cold October morning at Millbrook General Hospital, a German shepherd appeared at the emergency doors carrying a small, unconscious girl. The child was dirty, bruised, and had no identification. Nobody knew her name or where she came from. She was just another homeless soul that society had overlooked. Henry Morrison, a retired paramedic volunteering at the hospital, felt something stir in his heart when he saw her. The loyal dog refused to leave the girl's side, protecting her like family. Henry decided to help find out who she was and what had happened to her. As days passed, the three of them formed an unlikely bond that would change their lives forever. What was the connection between this mysterious child and the devoted dog? Who saved her life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Henry Morrison had always believed that purpose was something you earned through decades of service, not something that simply appeared at your doorstep on a Tuesday morning. At 67, he carried himself with the measured stride of a man who had seen enough emergencies to know that panic never saved anyone, but action always could. His hands, weathered and steady, still moved with the practiced precision that had guided countless patients through their darkest moments during his 38 years as a paramedic. The retirement badge sat in a small wooden box on his kitchen table, next to his old medical kit, both artifacts of a life spent responding to other people's crises. 3 years had passed since he'd turned in his uniform, and despite his wife Margaret's gentle suggestions about taking up golf or gardening, Henry found himself drawn back to Millbrook General Hospital every Tuesday and Thursday morning. Volunteering, they called it, though Henry suspected it was more like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Millbrook, Nebraska, was the kind of town where everyone knew your story before you finished telling it. Population 8,400, give or take whoever had moved away for college and never returned. Main Street stretched for exactly 12 blocks, anchored by Paulson's Hardware on one end and the First Methodist Church on the other. The hospital sat on Maple Avenue, a modest 2-story brick building that had served the community since 1962. Expanded twice and renovated once, but never quite large enough for the growing needs of the surrounding rural counties. Dr. Patricia Clemens, the emergency department chief, had been the one to suggest Henry volunteer. She was a practical woman in her early 50s who ran the department with the efficiency of someone who understood that small hospitals couldn't afford waste, not of time, resources, or good people. "We could use someone with your experience," she had said during their coffee meeting at Morrison's Cafe, the local diner that shared his family name, but no relation. Not for medical work, mind you, but for the human part. Sometimes people need someone who's been where they are. Ruth Hendricks, the charge nurse, had been more direct. "You're driving yourself crazy, sitting at home," she'd told him after Margaret's funeral. "Come help us drive ourselves crazy instead." Ruth had worked alongside Henry for 15 years when he was active, and she knew him well enough to recognize the signs of a man losing his moorings. The volunteer work was simple enough, greeting families in the waiting room, helping with discharge paperwork, occasionally assisting with patient transport. Nothing that required his medical certification, but everything that required his understanding of what it meant to be afraid and hurting in a place that smelled like antiseptic and fear. Henry found comfort in the familiar rhythms of the hospital, the quiet efficiency of morning rounds, the way crisis and routine danced together in an endless, predictable cycle. His own crisis had been quieter, but no less devastating. Sarah, his only daughter, had stopped returning his calls sometime around her 35th birthday. The reasons were complex and painful. Missed dance recitals during his younger, more ambitious years, a tendency to offer solutions when she needed support, his inability to show affection in ways she could understand. Margaret had been the bridge between them, translating Henry's gruff love into the gentler language Sarah needed. When Margaret died 2 years ago, that bridge collapsed. Leaving Henry and Sarah on opposite sides of a chasm neither seemed able to cross. The irony wasn't lost on him that a man who had spent his career rushing toward other people's emergencies had somehow missed all the warning signs in his own family. Sarah lived somewhere in Colorado now. Denver, he thought, though he wasn't certain. She was a social worker, last he'd heard, helping other people navigate the systems and relationships he'd failed to manage in his own home. The Christmas cards had stopped coming after Margaret's funeral, and Henry's own attempts at reaching out had yielded nothing but voicemail messages and eventual silence. This particular Tuesday morning had started like any other. Henry arrived at the hospital at 7:30, parked his 15-year-old Ford pickup in the volunteer spot near the back entrance, and made his way through the familiar hallways. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and the maple trees that gave the street its name were dropping their leaves in brilliant orange and gold carpets across the hospital grounds. Ruth was already at the nurse's station, her grey hair pinned back in the same efficient bun she'd worn for as long as Henry had known her. She looked up from her charting with the kind of smile reserved for people who had shared enough long shifts to speak in shorthand. "Morning, Henry." "Quiet." "Night, thank goodness. Dr. Clemens wants to see you when you get a chance. Something about helping with the new patient intake process." Henry nodded and poured himself coffee from the pot that Ruth maintained with the dedication of a high priest tending a sacred flame. The coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, which, in a hospital, seemed appropriate. He was halfway through his first cup when the automatic doors of the emergency entrance whooshed open, and his life changed forever. The security camera footage would later show the exact moment, 7:42 a.m., when a German shepherd, soaking wet from the morning rain, pushed through the doors, carrying something precious in his jaws. But Henry saw it with his own eyes, watched as the dog moved with careful, deliberate steps across the linoleum floor, his burden cradled as gently as a mother carries a sleeping infant. The child couldn't have weighed more than 40 pounds, her small frame made even more fragile by the oversized coat that hung around her like a tent. Her face was pale beneath the dirt, her dark hair matted against her skull, but it was her stillness that caught Henry's attention. She wasn't moving, wasn't breathing in the visible way that would have reassured him that she was merely sleeping. The dog, a magnificent animal despite his bedraggled appearance, lowered the girl to the floor with infinite care, then sat beside her with the kind of alert attention that Henry recognized from his years responding to accidents. This was a creature who understood the gravity of the situation, who had made a decision and seen it through with the kind of determination that saved lives. "Ruth," Henry called, his voice carrying the authority that 38 years of emergency medicine had trained into him. "We need a gurney and Dr. Clemens, now." The next few minutes moved with the choreographed urgency that Henry remembered from his active days. Ruth appeared with the gurney. Dr. Clemens emerged from her office, still holding her morning coffee, and together they transferred the child from the floor to the safety of the emergency bay. The dog followed every step, his eyes never leaving. The girl, his body language making it clear that he wasn't going anywhere. As they worked, Henry found himself studying the child's face. She was young, perhaps 5 or 6, with features that suggested she might be biracial, though malnutrition and exposure made it difficult to be certain. Her clothes were clean but worn, the kind of careful cleanliness that suggested someone had been taking care of her, even in difficult circumstances. Her hands were small and surprisingly soft, not the rough, chapped hands he might have expected from a child living on the streets. Dr. Clemens worked with quiet efficiency, checking vital signs, starting an IV, running through the protocols that would stabilize the child and begin the process of understanding what had happened to her. Dehydration, mild hypothermia, appears to be sleeping rather than unconscious, she murmured to Ruth, who was recording everything. No obvious signs of abuse or trauma, but we'll need x-rays and blood work. Henry found himself watching the dog as much as the medical team. The animal had positioned himself where he could see the child but wasn't interfering with the medical care. His coat was thick and well-maintained beneath the rain and dirt, his eyes intelligent and alert. This wasn't a stray dog. This was an animal who had been trained, cared for, loved. "What do we do about him?" Ruth asked, nodding toward the dog. "He stays," Dr. Clemens said without hesitation, "at least until we know more about the situation. If he brought her here, he's part of her story." Henry felt something settle in his chest, a recognition that this moment was significant in ways he couldn't yet understand. The child, the dog, the way they had appeared at the hospital like a question waiting for an answer, all of it spoke to something deeper than chance. As the medical team continued their work, Henry stepped closer to the dog. The animal looked up at him with eyes that seemed to carry their own weight of worry and responsibility. "You did good, boy," Henry said quietly. "You brought her to the right place." The dog's tail moved once, a subtle acknowledgement, before his attention returned to the child. Henry understood that feeling, the need to stay close, to watch over someone vulnerable, to be ready for whatever came next. Outside, the rain continued to fall against the hospital windows, but inside, 3 lives had begun to weave together, in ways that none of them could have predicted. Henry Morrison, the retired paramedic looking for purpose. An unnamed child who had fallen through every safety net society had tried to build. And a loyal dog who understood that sometimes love means carrying someone to safety, no matter how heavy the burden might be. The child opened her eyes exactly 2 hours and 17 minutes after the German shepherd had carried her through the hospital doors. Henry had been sitting in the chair beside her bed, reading an outdated copy of National Geographic, when he felt rather than saw the change in the room's atmosphere. The steady beep of the heart monitor remained constant, but something had shifted. When he looked up, he found himself staring into the darkest brown eyes he had ever seen. They were enormous. In her small face, alert and wary, scanning the room with the kind of careful assessment that belonged on someone much older. The child didn't move, didn't speak, but Henry could see her cataloguing everything: the IV in her arm, the hospital bed, the dog sleeping on a blanket Ruth had provided in the corner. "Hello there," Henry said softly, setting the magazine aside. "You're safe now. You're in the hospital and we're taking good care of you." The child's gaze moved to him, studied his face with the same careful attention she had given the room. Henry had the impression that she was measuring him, trying to determine if he represented safety or danger. After a long moment, she turned, her attention to the dog, and for the first time, her expression changed. Relief, love, and something that might have been gratitude flickered across her features. Dr. Clemens entered with the quiet professionalism that marked her approach to pediatric cases. She had changed from her standard white coat into a colorful sweater, a small concession to make herself seem less intimidating to young patients. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said, approaching the bed slowly. "I'm Dr. Clemens. How are you?" "Feeling?" The child's eyes followed the doctor's movement, but she didn't respond. Her gaze kept returning to the dog, as if seeking reassurance from the only familiar thing in this strange new environment. "Can you tell me your name?" Dr. Clemens asked gently. Silence. "Are you hungry? We have some soup that might taste good." The child's stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, but still she didn't speak. Henry watched the interaction with growing concern. The child was clearly alert and aware, but her silence felt deliberate rather than medical. This wasn't the confusion of someone recovering from unconsciousness. This was the careful quiet of someone who had learned that speaking could be dangerous. Officer Maria Santos arrived during the lunch hour, her uniform softened by a genuine smile and the kind of patient demeanor that came from years of working with traumatized children. She was Millbrook's only female officer and had developed a reputation for her skill in handling delicate situations. No missing person reports matching her description, she told Henry and Dr. Clemens in the hallway outside the child's room. I've contacted the state police, and they're running her through the national databases, but so far nothing. No Amber Alerts, no recent reports of missing children in the region. Henry felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. How is that possible? Someone must be looking for her. Officer Santos shook her head slowly. You'd be surprised how many children fall through the cracks. Undocumented families, children living with relatives who aren't legal guardians, kids in informal care arrangements. There are a dozen reasons why a missing child might not generate an official report. Dr. Clemens checked her tablet, reviewing the test results that had been coming in throughout the morning. Blood work shows signs of chronic malnutrition, but nothing acute. She's been getting some nutrition, just not consistently. No signs of sexual abuse, no recent trauma that we can detect. But Henry's right. Someone's been taking care of her. Her teeth have been brushed recently. Her hair was clean before she got caught in the rain. This isn't a child who's been completely abandoned. What about the dog? Henry asked. Officer Santos consulted her notes. No collar, no tags, but he's clearly been well cared for. Purebred German Shepherd, probably 4 or 5 years old. Excellent condition. Someone invested significant money in that animal. I've contacted animal control, but given the circumstances, they're willing to let him stay here temporarily. The social worker arrived that afternoon. Monica Rivera was a tired-looking woman in her 40s who carried herself with the weary competence of someone who had seen too many difficult cases and not enough happy endings. She wore practical clothes and comfortable shoes, and her briefcase bulged with the kind of paperwork that represented children caught between systems. Jane Doe cases are always challenging, she explained to Henry and Dr. Clemens during their impromptu meeting in the hospital's small conference room. Without identification, without family, she becomes a ward of the state by default. We'll need to place her in emergency foster care while we try to determine her identity. She hasn't spoken, Dr. Clemens said. Not a single word since she arrived, Monica nodded grimly. Selective mutism isn't uncommon in cases involving trauma. Children sometimes stop speaking when they feel unsafe or when they've experienced something overwhelming. It can take weeks or months to reverse, assuming she starts talking at all. Henry found himself leaning forward. What about the dog? They're clearly bonded. That's going to be a problem, Monica admitted. Foster families are usually reluctant to take on a large dog along with a traumatized child. Most of our emergency placements won't accommodate animals. So you're going to separate them? The sharpness in Henry's voice surprised even him. Monica's expression softened slightly. Mr. Morrison, I understand your concern, but we have to work within the system we have. The child's immediate safety and medical needs have to take priority. That dog brought her here, Henry said firmly. He saved her life. How is separating them in her best interest? Dr. Clemens touched Henry's arm gently. Let's focus on getting her stable first. We can address the placement issues once we know more about her condition. But Henry had already made a decision that would change the course of all their lives. That evening, after the hospital had settled into its night shift routine, he found himself sitting beside the child's bed again. The dog had been moved to the floor, but remained close enough to touch the bed with his nose. Both of them were sleeping, but it was the kind of light sleep that came from months of staying alert to danger. The child's medical chart lay on the bedside table, stamped with the words Jane Doe in red letters. Someone had estimated her age. At 6, though Henry suspected she might be younger, malnutrition had a way of making children seem older than their years. Her blood type was O positive. Her height and weight placed her in the lower percentiles for her estimated age. Everything else, her name, her family, her story, remained blank. Henry picked up the chart and studied the sparse information. Somewhere in the world, someone was missing this child. Someone had taught her to brush her teeth, had cared enough to keep her clothes clean even while living rough. Someone had loved her enough that she had bonded with this remarkable dog who had risked everything to bring her to safety. The security camera footage showed the moment of their arrival, 7:42 a.m. on October 15th, a Tuesday morning that had started like any other, but had become the pivot point around which everything else would turn. The dog's careful handling of the child, his immediate assessment of the hospital as a safe place, his protective positioning afterward, all of it spoke to intelligence and training that went beyond ordinary pet behavior. Henry made a note in his phone to research German Shepherd training programs, military working dogs, service animal organizations. Somewhere in that dog's behavior were clues to his past, and his past might lead them to the child's story. As he prepared to leave for the night, Henry found himself looking back at the sleeping pair one more time. The child had turned slightly, in her sleep, and her small hand hung over the edge of the bed. The dog had shifted position so that her fingers could just brush against his fur. Even in sleep, they were taking care of each other. "I'm going to find out who you are," Henry whispered. "Both of you. And I'm going to make sure you stay together." The promise felt like something more than words. It felt like the beginning of a purpose he hadn't known he was looking for. Henry began his investigation the next morning with the methodical approach that had served him well during 38 years of emergency medicine. He arrived at the hospital an hour earlier than usual, parking under the streetlight that illuminated the staff parking lot, and made his first discovery before he even entered the building. The dog, whom the nursing staff had started calling Scout, though Henry wasn't sure why, had worn a collar. The leather was old and weathered, with scratches and scuffs that spoke of years of use. Ruth had removed it during the initial medical examination and placed it with the few other items they had found. The child's oversized coat, her small sneakers with holes worn through the soles, and a pair of socks that had been darned multiple times with different colored thread. Henry examined the collar under the fluorescent lights of the supply closet where they had stored the belongings. The leather was quality, the kind that cost real money and was made to last, but the brass nameplate that should have held identification information had been deliberately removed, leaving only small screw holes as evidence of its previous existence. Someone had wanted to erase this dog's identity as thoroughly as they had the child's, but people who spent years responding to emergencies learned to look beyond the obvious. Henry found what he was searching for in the pattern of wear around the collar's buckle. The leather showed consistent marking at one particular length. Scout had worn this collar at the same adjustment for a long time. More telling were the faint impressions left by some kind of military-style tags. The metal hadn't left permanent marks, but the pressure and movement over time had created barely visible indentations in the leather. "Military working dog," Henry murmured to himself, running his finger along the evidence. The precision of Scout's behavior, his calm demeanor in stressful situations, his protective instincts without aggression, all of it pointed to professional training. His first stop was the Millbrook Public Library, a modest brick building that served the town's intellectual needs with determination, if not grandeur. Mrs. Patterson, the librarian who had helped Henry research medical journals during his paramedic training decades earlier, greeted him with the same efficient enthusiasm she had shown then. "Military working dogs," she repeated, leading him to the computer terminals. "That's a specific search. Most people come in here looking for dog training or pet care. What makes you think military?" Henry explained about Scout's behavior, the collar wear patterns, the training evident in his responses. Mrs. Patterson nodded thoughtfully as she pulled up databases and websites that Henry wouldn't have known existed. "German Shepherds are common in military service," she said, navigating through pages of information. "Police work, bomb detection, search and rescue, personal protection. They're usually paired with a single handler and form strong bonds. When handlers retire or..." She paused tactfully. When handlers are no longer able to serve, the dogs sometimes need new placements. The information painted a picture that both encouraged and worried Henry. If Scout was a former military working dog, he would have had extensive training and a documented service history. But he would also have been bonded to a specific person, and the separation from that person might explain how he had ended up caring for a homeless child. Henry's next stop was the county social services office, a low-slung building that managed to look both institutional and underfunded. Monica Rivera met him in a conference room that smelled like coffee and desperation, her desk covered with files that represented other children caught in various bureaucratic tangles. "I've been making calls about your Jane Doe," she said before. Henry could explain his visit. Still no missing person reports, no matches in the national databases. It's like she doesn't exist in any official capacity. What does that mean for her placement? Monica leaned back in her chair, and Henry could see the weight of too many difficult cases in her expression. Emergency foster care probably starting. "This weekend, I have a family in Lincoln who might be willing to take her temporarily, but they can't accommodate the dog. The dog is part of her support system," Henry said firmly. "Separating them could cause additional trauma." "I understand that, Mr. Morrison, but we work within the constraints we have. Foster families are already stretching to take on children with special needs. Adding a large, unknown dog to the equation—" "He's not unknown," Henry interrupted. "I think he's a former military working dog. He's trained, disciplined, protective without being aggressive. He brought her to the hospital, for God's sake." Monica made notes on her legal pad, but her expression remained skeptical. "Even if that's true, it doesn't change the placement realities. Most foster families simply can't or won't take on both a traumatized child and a large dog." Henry left the social services office with a growing sense of urgency. The system was going to separate the child and Scout, regardless of their bond, regardless of the trauma it might cause. The decision would be made based on bureaucratic convenience, rather than the child's actual needs. His afternoon was spent visiting every homeless shelter, soup kitchen, and community outreach center within a 50-mile radius of Millbrook. He showed photos of the child and Scout to volunteers and staff members, hoping someone might recognize them or remember seeing them together. At the Cornerstone Mission in Grand Island, he met Father Mackenzie, an elderly priest who had been running the facility for 20 years. The priest studied the photos with the careful attention of someone who had learned to see beyond surface appearances. "The child? No," he said slowly. "But the dog?" He paused, squinting at the image. "There was a man who came through here. Occasionally, maybe 6 months ago. Older gentleman, military bearing. He had a German shepherd that looked very much like this one. They never stayed overnight. The man seemed to have resources, but he would come by for meals sometimes." Henry felt his pulse quicken. "Do you remember anything else about him? His name? Where he might have been staying?" Father Mackenzie shook his head regretfully. "He kept to himself mostly, but I remember thinking he was taking care of someone else. He would always ask for extra food, more than one person could eat. And the dog was clearly well trained, well cared for. Not like most of the animals you see with homeless folks, if you'll forgive my saying so." The pieces were beginning to form a picture, though it remained incomplete. An older man, possibly military, caring for both the dog and the child. Something had happened to separate them, leaving Scout to care for the child alone until the situation became desperate enough to seek help. Henry's final stop was the Millbrook Police Department, where Officer Santos was finishing her shift. She'd been making her own inquiries and had information that added another layer to the mystery. "I talked to the night security guard at the hospital," she said, pouring coffee from a pot that looked like it had been brewing since morning. "He says he's seen the dog before, maybe 3 or 4 times over the past few weeks, always at night, always alone, like he was checking out the hospital. The guard figured he was just a stray looking for food scraps. He was scouting," Henry realized. He was learning the hospital layout, figuring out how to get help when the child needed it, Officer Santos nodded. That's some serious intelligence for an animal. The kind of training and problem-solving ability that comes from professional development. As Henry drove home that evening, he found himself thinking about loyalty and responsibility. Scout had spent weeks preparing to save the child's life, learning the hospital routines, identifying it as a place of safety and healing. When the crisis came, he had executed a plan that most humans wouldn't have been capable of developing. The child had survived because someone, first the mysterious, older man, then Scout, had refused to abandon her. Now it was Henry's turn to prove worthy of that same loyalty. The breakthrough came on Thursday morning, when Henry arrived to find the child sitting up in bed, staring intently at something in her small hands. Scout was positioned beside her, his attention focused on whatever had captured her interest. Ruth stood in the doorway, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. She had it hidden in her coat pocket, Ruth whispered to Henry. We missed it during the initial intake because it was folded so small. She's been looking at it for 20 minutes. Henry approached the bed slowly, moving with the careful deliberation he had learned from years of working with frightened patients. The child glanced up at him, and for the first time since her arrival, her expression showed something other than wariness. There was a question in her dark eyes, as if she were trying to decide whether to trust him with something precious. That looks important, Henry said softly, settling into the chair beside her bed. Would you like to show me? The child's fingers tightened around the paper, for that's what it was, Henry realized, a piece of paper folded until it was no larger than a postage stamp. She looked at Scout, then back at Henry, weighing her options with the gravity of someone much older than her apparent 6 years. Finally, with movements that suggested the paper was fragile beyond measure, she began to unfold it. The creases were deep and numerous, evidence of repeated folding and unfolding. As she smoothed it against the hospital blanket, Henry found himself looking at a child's drawing, the kind of artwork that decorated refrigerators and classroom bulletin boards across the country. But this drawing told a story that made Henry's chest tighten with understanding. The house was drawn in the simple style that children use, a rectangle with a triangle roof, windows represented by squares with X marks through them. But the details revealed careful observation and love. There were curtains in the windows, flowers in boxes beneath the sills, a mailbox beside the front door. This wasn't a generic house. From a child's imagination, this was a specific place, drawn from memory and affection. Standing in front of the house were 3 stick figures. The largest was clearly an adult man, drawn with careful attention to details that mattered to a child. A hat on his head, glasses on his face, shoes that looked like boots. Beside him was a smaller figure that could only be the child herself, her stick arms reaching up toward the man's hand, and running in front of both human figures was an unmistakable representation of Scout, drawn with the kind of loving detail that only came from close observation. Pointed ears, a bushy tail, 4 legs in motion as if caught mid-run. But it was the colors that revealed the full story. The house was drawn in warm yellows and browns, the flowers bright reds and purples, the grass a vivid green. The man wore a blue shirt and brown pants, and the child had colored her own figure in pink and purple. Scout was rendered in realistic shades of brown and black, his collar carefully colored in dark brown. This wasn't just a drawing, it was a memorial, a record of happiness that had been lost but was too precious to forget. That's a beautiful picture, Henry said, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't entirely hide. Is that your house? The child's finger traced the outline of the house, and Henry saw her lips move slightly, as if she were trying to remember how to form words. She looked at Scout, who had been watching the entire interaction with alert intelligence, and something passed between them. Some communication that didn't require language. Then, so quietly that Henry had to lean forward to hear her, she whispered a single word, "Grandpa." Ruth stepped closer, her nursing instincts activated by this first breakthrough in communication. "That's your grandpa in the picture?" The child nodded, her finger now tracing the stick figure of the man. Her lips moved again, and Henry caught the shape of another word, though no sound emerged. "Marcus! Your grandpa's name is Marcus?" Henry asked gently. Another nod, more certain this time. The child looked at Scout again, and Henry could see her gathering courage for something more difficult. "Scout," she whispered, pointing to the drawing of the dog. Then, with visible effort, she added, "Grandpa Marcus's Scout." The words were like puzzle pieces falling into place. An older man named Marcus, with military bearing and a trained German shepherd. A beloved granddaughter who had lived with him in a house with flower boxes and careful details. Something had happened to Marcus, leaving Scout to care for the child, alone until the situation became desperate. Dr. Clemens arrived during Henry's conversation with Ruth about the drawing. She studied the artwork with the clinical eye of someone trained to recognize trauma markers in children's expressions. But Henry could see that she was also moved by the obvious love and loss represented in the simple stick figures. "The fact that she's beginning to communicate is very positive," Dr. Clemens said quietly. "But we need to be careful not to push too hard. Trust takes time to rebuild, especially when a child has experienced significant loss." Henry spent the rest of the morning researching the name Marcus in connection with military records and German shepherds. The Millbrook Public Library's computer system connected him to veterans organizations, military databases, and service animal registries. It was painstaking work, complicated by the fact that Marcus was a common name and German shepherds were widely used in military service. But persistence had always been one of Henry's strengths. By lunchtime, he had compiled a list of 17 men named Marcus who had served in the military and had been associated with German shepherd working dogs in the Nebraska region over the past decade. The list included active duty personnel, veterans, and retired military working dog handlers. His afternoon was spent making phone calls, a process that required patience and diplomacy. Military records were protected. Veterans organizations were cautious about sharing information, and many of the phone numbers he found were outdated or disconnected. But Henry had learned something about persistence during his years as a paramedic. Sometimes the most important discoveries came only after repeated attempts and careful attention to seemingly small details. The break came during his 15th phone call to a veterans organization in Grand Island that specialized in supporting former military working dog handlers. The woman who answered, Sandra Reese, listened carefully to Henry's explanation of the situation. A German shepherd named Scout with an elderly handler named Marcus. She repeated slowly, "Mr. Morrison, I think you might be looking for Marcus Thompson. He was one of our members until—" She paused, and Henry heard papers rustling. "Until about 6 months ago. He passed away in April, and his dog went missing around the same time. We assumed Scout had run away, which sometimes happens when military working dogs lose their handlers." Henry felt his heart rate increase. "Did Marcus Thompson have family? A granddaughter?" "He did," Sandra said softly. "A little girl he was caring for after her parents died. Social services were supposed to handle the placement after Marcus passed, but there were complications. The child disappeared before they could arrange care. We always wondered what happened to her." The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, but Henry realized that understanding the past was only the first step towards securing the child's future. Sandra Reese, from the Veterans Organization, agreed to meet Henry the following morning at a coffee shop in Grand Island. She brought with her a manila folder that contained Marcus Thompson's membership records and a photograph that made Henry's throat tighten with understanding. The photo showed a man in his early 70s wearing a veteran's cap and standing beside a magnificent German shepherd. But it was the third figure in the photo that confirmed everything Henry had suspected. A little girl, perhaps 5 years old, stood between the man and the dog, her small hands resting on Scout's neck, her face bright with the kind of unguarded happiness that children show when they feel completely safe and loved. Marcus was a good man, Sandra said, stirring sugar into her coffee with the slow movements of someone choosing her words carefully. 22 years in the army, specialized in training and handling military working dogs. Scout was his last partner before retirement. When Marcus left the service, he was allowed to adopt Scout. It's common for handlers to keep their dogs when they retire. Henry studied the photograph, seeing in the little girl's face the same bone structure and coloring as the child now lying in Millbrook General Hospital. What happened to her parents? Sandra's expression grew somber. Car accident. About 2 years ago, Marcus's son David and his wife were killed in a collision with a drunk driver outside Denver. Emma, that's the little girl's name, Emma Thompson, came to live with Marcus afterward. He was her only family. Emma. Finally, the child had a name, an identity, a story that explained the love and loss Henry had seen in her eyes. What happened? When Marcus died, heart attack, sudden and massive. He was working in his garden one morning, and his neighbor found him that afternoon. Scout was sitting beside him, wouldn't let the paramedics near until the neighbor convinced him it was okay. Sandra opened the folder and pulled out a copy of an official document. Marcus had named Emma as his heir, but he hadn't updated his will to include guardianship arrangements. She was supposed to go into state custody temporarily while they sorted out the family situation. Henry felt a familiar anger rising, the same frustration he had experienced countless times when bureaucratic systems failed the people they were supposed to protect. But she disappeared before that could happen. The day before the social workers were supposed to pick her up, Marcus's neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski, was watching Emma temporarily. But when she went to check on her that morning, both Emma and Scout were gone. Mrs. Kowalski thought maybe they'd gone for a walk, but when they didn't come back, Sandra shrugged helplessly. What could a 6-year-old and a dog do on their own? Everyone assumed they'd turn up within a day or two. That was 6 months ago. 6 months, Sandra confirmed. We organized search parties, contacted animal shelters, posted flyers. It was like they vanished completely. Mrs. Kowalski blamed herself, said she should have been watching more carefully. But honestly, who expects a child and a dog to disappear so completely? Henry studied the photograph again, noting details he had missed before. Marcus Thompson wore the kind of sturdy work clothes that suggested a man who stayed active in retirement. His hands, visible as they rested on Emma's shoulders, were weathered but gentle. Scout's posture in the photo was alert but relaxed, the stance of a dog who felt secure in his role as family protector. Marcus had money troubles toward the end, Sandra continued. Medical bills mostly. He'd been fighting cancer for about a year before he died. He managed to keep it from Emma, didn't want to worry her, but he'd been selling things, trying to keep the house. The neighbor said he was behind on the mortgage. The picture was becoming clearer, and it explained much about what Henry had observed. Marcus had been struggling financially while battling illness, trying to provide for Emma while dealing with his own mortality. When he died suddenly, Emma faced not just the loss of her beloved grandfather, but the prospect of losing her home and being separated from Scout. A 6-year-old wouldn't understand the legal complexities, Henry mused. She would just know that strangers were coming to take her away from the only family she had left. Sandra nodded sadly. Scout probably sensed her distress. Military working dogs are trained to protect their assigned personnel, and if he saw Emma as family, she didn't need to finish the thought. Henry pulled out his phone and showed Sandra the security camera footage from the hospital. As Sandra watched Scout carry Emma through the emergency doors, tears gathered in her eyes. He kept her alive for 6 months, she whispered. A dog and a 6-year-old surviving on their own for 6 months. The magnitude of Scout's achievement was staggering when Henry really considered it. The dog had not only kept Emma fed and protected, but he had also recognized when the situation had become too dangerous for him to handle alone. His repeated visits to the hospital over recent weeks suddenly made perfect sense. He had been preparing, learning, ensuring that when the crisis came, he would know exactly where to take Emma for help. "There's something else," Sandra said, pulling a final document from the folder. Marcus had been trying to locate Emma's maternal family before he died. He was worried about what would happen to her if something happened to him. There was an aunt somewhere, I think in Colorado or Wyoming, but Marcus hadn't been able to make contact. Henry felt his pulse quicken. Emma's aunt might still be out there, might still be searching for her niece. "Do you have any information about the aunt?" Sandra shook her head regretfully. "Just a first name. Jennifer, I think." Marcus mentioned her a few times during our support group meetings, said she was a social worker, but they'd lost touch after. David and his wife died. Family dynamics can be complicated when there's been trauma. As Henry drove back to Millbrook, he found himself thinking about the layers of loss that Emma had experienced. First her parents, in a sudden traumatic accident. Then her grandfather, the man who had stepped in to provide love and stability, taken by an equally sudden heart attack. Finally, the threat of being separated from Scout, the last connection to the family she had loved. No wonder she had stopped speaking. No wonder she had retreated into the careful silence of someone who had learned that attachment led to loss. But she had also shown remarkable courage, trusting Scout's judgment enough to let him bring her to safety when survival required more than they could manage alone. The dog tags that Henry had suspected were hidden in Scout's collar proved to be exactly where he thought they would be. Ruth helped him search Scout's thick fur that afternoon, and they found the metal tags secured to the collar with heavy-duty tape, hidden beneath the layers of undercoat. The tags confirmed everything Sandra had told him. Scout's military service, number, Marcus Thompson's name and service information, and an emergency contact number that was no longer in service. But the tags also provided something Sandra hadn't mentioned, Marcus's full military record number, which would allow Henry to access more detailed information through Veterans Affairs. As Henry studied the tags, Scout watched him with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand the significance of what was being revealed. This dog had carried not just Emma's physical weight to safety, but also the weight of responsibility for preserving a family's history and identity. "You did everything right, boy," Henry told Scout quietly. "Everything Marcus taught you, everything. You learned about protecting family, you did it all perfectly." Scout's tail moved once, a subtle acknowledgement, before his attention returned to Emma. Even now, even with help and safety assured, his vigilance never completely relaxed. Some responsibilities, Henry realized, were too important to ever fully set aside. The Veterans Affairs office in Lincoln was housed in a building that looked like it had been constructed during an era when government architecture was meant to convey permanence and dignity. Henry sat in a waiting room that smelled of floor, wax and old coffee, holding a folder containing Scout's dog tags, the photograph Sandra had given him, and Emma's drawing. Patricia Welsh, the VA benefits coordinator, was a woman in her 50s who carried herself with the crisp efficiency of someone who had served before transitioning to civilian service. She examined Marcus Thompson's military records on her computer screen with the careful attention that Henry recognized from his own years dealing with medical documentation. "Master Sergeant Marcus Thompson," she read aloud. "Distinguished service. Record, multiple deployments, specialized in military working dog programs. Clean record, honorable discharge in 2018. She looked up at Henry. "What exactly are you hoping to find?" Henry explained the situation. Emma's discovery, her months of homelessness with Scout, the need to locate any family members who might be searching for her. Patricia listened with the kind of focused attention that came from years of helping. "Veterans navigate bureaucratic systems. I can tell you that Marcus listed his son David as his emergency contact until David's death in 2022, she said, scrolling through screens of information. After that, he updated his records to list Emma Thompson as his dependent, but there's no other family listed. No mention of an aunt named Jennifer. Patricia shook her head, then paused. Wait, there's a note here in his file from about 8 months ago. Marcus requested help locating family members for his granddaughter's emergency contacts. He was specifically looking for his daughter-in-law's sister. She pulled up another screen. Jennifer Morrison, last known address in Denver, Colorado, works in social services. Henry felt his blood stop moving. Morrison, the same last name that was painted on the water tower at the edge of Millbrook, the same name on the diner where he had coffee every morning, the same name he had carried for 67 years. Did you say Morrison? Patricia checked her screen again. Jennifer Morrison, maiden name Jennifer Chen. She was married to someone named Morrison, but the records don't show current status. The world seemed to tilt slightly around Henry as connections he had never imagined began forming in his mind. Morrison wasn't an uncommon name, but combined with the location and the timing, it suggested possibilities that made his hands tremble as he reached for his phone. I need to make a call, he told Patricia, stepping outside into the parking lot, where the October air was sharp enough to clear his thoughts. Sarah answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the cautious tone she had used with him for the past several years. Dad? Is everything okay? Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Henry's voice was steadier than he felt. Did you ever have a sister-in-law named Jennifer, someone married to a Thompson? The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Henry began to wonder if the call had dropped. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Dad, where are you? And why are you asking about Jennifer? I'm at the VA office in Lincoln. Sarah, I need you to tell me about Jennifer Thompson. Another pause, shorter this time, followed by what sounded like Sarah sitting down heavily. Jennifer was married to my ex-husband's brother, David Thompson. They both died in a car accident a couple of years ago. They had a little girl, Emma, who went to live with David's father after... Her voice trailed off, then returned with sudden urgency. Dad, why are you asking about Emma? Do you know something about Emma? Henry found himself leaning against his truck, the October wind cutting through his jacket as the full magnitude of the situation became clear. Sarah, Emma is here. In Millbrook, in the hospital. She's been missing for 6 months. That's impossible. Emma disappeared from her grandfather's house in Grand Island. Social services has been looking for her. I've been looking for her. Sarah's voice was rising, taking on the edge of panic that Henry remembered from her childhood when she was trying to process something too large to understand. Dad, if Emma is there, if you have Emma, she's safe, Henry said quickly. She's in the hospital, she's safe, and she's being cared for. Sarah, I need you to come to Nebraska. I need you to come now. I'm already packing, Sarah said, and Henry could hear movement in the background, the sounds of someone dropping everything to respond to crisis. Dad, is she okay? Is she hurt? What happened to her? Henry looked back at the VA building, thinking about everything he had learned over the past week. She's been living on the streets with Marcus's dog for 6 months. The dog brought her to the hospital when she got sick. Sarah, she's been surviving on her own since she was 6 years old. The sound that came from the other end of the line was somewhere between a sob and a gasp. I tried to find her after Marcus died, but the social workers said she was in state custody, and then when I called back they said she was missing and nobody could tell me anything useful, and I kept calling, but Sarah, Henry interrupted gently, she's safe now. We're going to take care of her. Both of us. Both of us. The question carried years of hurt and confusion. You're her aunt. I'm her great-grandfather. She needs family, not more strangers making decisions about her life. Henry could hear Sarah crying now, the kind of tears that came from relief and grief and hope all tangled together. Dad, I didn't even know you knew about Emma. I didn't know you knew about Jennifer, about any of it. We have a lot to talk about, Henry said softly, but first, we need to focus on Emma. She's been through more than any child should have to endure, and she's going to need all of us to help her heal. When Henry returned to the hospital that afternoon, he found Emma sitting up in bed, still clutching her drawing, but now engaged in what appeared to be a serious conversation with Scout. She was speaking in whispers, too quiet for Henry to hear. The words, but the fact that she was speaking at all, represented progress that made his chest tight with hope. Ruth approached him with an update that added another layer of complexity to the situation. Monica Rivera called this morning. She's found a foster placement for Emma starting Monday, a family in Lincoln that specializes in children with trauma histories. That's not going to happen, Henry said with quiet certainty. Ruth raised an eyebrow. Henry, you can't just decide that social services. Her aunt is driving here from Colorado. Her aunt, who's been searching for her for 6 months, who's a licensed social worker herself, who has legal standing to petition for custody. Ruth's expression shifted from skepticism to understanding. You found her family. I found our family, Henry corrected. Emma is my great-granddaughter. Sarah is my daughter. And after 3 years of not speaking to each other, we're about to figure out how to be a family again. As if sensing the shift in the room's emotional climate, Emma looked up from her conversation with Scout. For the first time since her arrival, she made direct eye contact with Henry and held it. In her dark eyes, he saw a question that went beyond words, a child's fundamental need to know if the adults around her could be trusted to keep her safe. Emma, Henry said softly, moving closer to her bed. Your Aunt Jennifer is coming to see you. She's been looking for you for a very long time. Emma's grip on her drawing tightened, but she didn't look away. After a long moment, she whispered, a single word that contained all the hope and fear that had sustained her through 6 months of homelessness. Family. Sarah arrived at Millbrook General Hospital at 11:30 that night, driving through darkness and determination to reach the niece she had been searching for since April. Henry met her in the parking lot, and for a moment they stood facing each other under the yellow glow of the security lights, two people who had shared a lifetime but hadn't spoken in 3 years. She looked older than Henry remembered, with streaks of grey in her dark hair that hadn't been there when he last saw her at Margaret's funeral. But her eyes held the same fierce intelligence that had driven her through college and graduate school, the same compassionate strength that had led her into social work, despite Henry's practical concerns about the financial challenges of that career choice. She's sleeping, Henry said, breaking the silence that stretched between them. But she's stable, she's safe, and she's been asking about you since this afternoon. Sarah's composure cracked slightly. She remembered me? I think she remembered that someone was supposed to come for her, someone named Jennifer who cared enough to keep looking. They walked through the hospital corridors in the kind of quiet that comes when people are processing emotions too large for immediate words. Henry led Sarah to Emma's room, where Scout was maintaining his vigil beside the bed, his alert eyes tracking their movement, but his body language indicating that he had assessed them as non-threatening. Emma was curled on her side, her small, and extended over the edge of the bed so that her fingers rested against Scout's fur. The drawing that had become her most precious possession was tucked against her chest, protected even in sleep. In the dim light from the hallway, she looked impossibly small and fragile, but there was something in her sleeping posture that suggested the kind of resilience that had kept her alive through 6 months of impossibility. "Oh, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face as she approached the bed. "I'm so sorry it took me so long to find you." Emma's eyes opened at the sound of Sarah's voice, and Henry watched as recognition dawned in her dark gaze. She sat up slowly, studying Sarah's face with the careful attention she had shown everything since her arrival at the hospital. "Aunt Jennifer?" The words were barely audible, spoken with the tentative hope of someone who had learned that good things could disappear without warning. "Yes, baby, it's me. I've been looking for you everywhere." Emma launched herself from the bed into Sarah's arms with a force that nearly knocked Sarah backward. The reunion was wordless for several minutes, just the sound of crying and whispered Reassurances, and the kind of fierce holding that tried to make up for months of separation and fear. Henry found himself watching from the doorway, remembering another hospital room 25 years earlier, when Sarah had been the one in the bed, recovering from pneumonia, and he had been the father trying to balance work obligations with the need to be present for his sick child. He had failed that test, choosing to respond to an emergency call instead of staying with Sarah through the night. Margaret had never said it directly, but Henry had seen the disappointment in her eyes, the recognition that their daughter would learn she couldn't count on him to be there when she needed him most. Now, watching Sarah comfort Emma with the kind of natural grace that Henry had never possessed, he understood something about the patterns that had shaped their family. Sarah had learned early that the adults in her life might disappear when she needed them most, and so she had become someone who specialized in being there for other people's children. Emma had learned the same lesson even younger, and so she had developed the hypervigilance that had kept her alive, but also kept her from trusting completely. "I tried to find you after Grandpa Marcus died," Sarah was saying, stroking Emma's hair with gentle fingers. "I called the social workers, I called the police, I even drove to Grand Island and walked through the neighborhoods where people said you might have gone. I never stopped looking. Scout took care of me," Emma said, her voice muffled against Sarah's shoulder. "He found food and places to sleep and kept me warm when it was cold. He knew you would come." Sarah looked at Scout with an expression of gratitude that made Henry's throat tighten. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for taking care of her when I couldn't." Scout's tail moved once in acknowledgement, but his attention remained focused on Emma, as if he needed to be certain that this reunion was real and permanent before he could relax his vigilance. Dr. Clemens appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sounds of conversation in a room that had been quiet for days. She took in the scene, Emma in Sarah's arms, Henry standing watch, Scout maintaining his protective position, and Henry could see her making the mental adjustments that came when a medical case transformed into a family reunion. "You must be Jennifer," she said to Sarah. "I'm Dr. Clemens. I've been taking care of Emma since she arrived." Sarah looked up without releasing her hold on Emma. "How is she? Really? Is she going to be okay?" Dr. Clemens moved into the room with the kind of careful professionalism that Henry recognized from his own medical training. "Physically, she's recovering well. The malnutrition was significant, but not irreversible, and she's responding well to treatment. Emotionally," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "she's been through significant trauma, the loss of her grandfather, months of homelessness, the constant stress of survival. It's going to take time and patience to help her process all of that. But she's talking now," Sarah said, and Henry could hear the hope in her voice. "She started talking yesterday primarily to your father." Dr. Clemens glanced at Henry. "He's been here every day reading to her, just sitting with her when she couldn't sleep. I think she decided he was safe." Sarah looked at Henry with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You've been taking care of her." "We all have," Henry said, but Sarah shook her head. "Dad, you don't understand. I've been calling social services twice a week since April, trying to get information about Emma. They kept telling me that because I wasn't officially listed as a guardian, they couldn't share details about her case. When she disappeared, they said there was nothing they could do to help me search for her because I didn't have legal standing." Henry felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you hadn't found her, if you hadn't decided to get involved, Emma would have disappeared into the foster system or worse. You saved her life as much as Scout did." The weight of that statement hung in the air between them. Henry had thought he was simply doing what anyone would do, helping a child in need, using his connections and experience to solve a mystery. But Sarah was right. Without his intervention, Emma would have become Jane Doe indefinitely. One more child lost in an overburdened system that couldn't afford to spend resources on cases without obvious solutions. "I couldn't let them separate her from Scout," Henry said finally. "They belonged together." "Like we belong together," Sarah said softly, And Henry understood that she wasn't just talking about Emma and Scout. Monica Rivera arrived the next morning, with paperwork and a legal complexity that threatened to overshadow the emotional reunion. She studied the family group gathered in Emma's room: Henry, Sarah, Emma, and Scout, with the expression of someone trying to fit new information into established procedures. "This changes things significantly," she said, settling into the chair that Henry had occupied for the past week. "Ms. Morrison, you're saying that you're Emma's biological aunt and that you've been searching for her since your former brother-in-law's death." "That's correct," Sarah said, her arm still protectively around Emma. "I can provide documentation of the family relationship, my professional credentials as a licensed social worker, and evidence of my attempts to locate Emma through official channels." Monica made notes on her legal pad, but Henry could see the wheels of bureaucracy beginning to turn. The question becomes one of legal standing versus Emma's best interests. "You weren't named as guardian in Marcus Thompson's will." "Because Marcus died suddenly," Sarah interrupted. "We were in the process of working out arrangements for Emma's care, but he had a heart attack before we could formalize anything." "And Emma has been bonded with your father during her recovery," Monica continued. "From a psychological perspective, removing her from his care now could cause additional trauma." Henry found himself studying the faces around him. Emma, still pale, but more alert than she had been since her arrival. Sarah, fierce with maternal protective instincts that had been dormant but never absent. Scout, watchful and patient, understanding that important decisions were being made about his family's future. What if she didn't have to be removed from anyone's care? Henry asked quietly. What if we all took care of her together? Sarah looked at him with surprise and something that might have been gratitude. Dad, what are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that Emma needs both of us. You're her aunt. You have the legal standing and the professional knowledge to navigate the system. I'm her great-grandfather. I live here where she's established medical care and where Scout is comfortable. Maybe the solution isn't choosing between us. Maybe it's figuring out how to be a family. Emma looked back and forth between the adults, discussing her future, and Henry could see her trying to understand whether this conversation meant security or another disruption. Finally, she spoke with the clear voice of someone who had learned to advocate for her own needs. I want to stay with Grandpa Henry and Aunt Jennifer and Scout, all of us together. The simplicity of her request contained multitudes, the deep human need for belonging, the wisdom of a child who understood that families could be created as well as inherited, and the recognition that some bonds transcended traditional categories. Monica made a final note on her pad and looked up with the expression of someone who had found an unexpected solution to a complicated problem. I think we can make that work. The family court hearing was scheduled for the following Friday, giving Henry and Sarah exactly 1 week to prepare their case for joint custody of Emma. What should have been a straightforward family reunification had become complicated by bureaucratic requirements, home studies, character evaluations, and the kind of legal documentation that transformed human relationships into filed paperwork. Henry spent Monday morning in his kitchen, sorting through 3 decades of personal documents spread across the table like pieces of a life puzzle. Sarah sat across from him, her laptop open to state guardianship requirements, methodically building their case with the precision that had made her successful in social work. We need character references, Sarah said, scrolling through a checklist. People who can testify to your stability, your caregiving capabilities, your commitment to Emma's welfare. Henry thought about the network of relationships he had built over 38 years as a paramedic, supplemented by his recent volunteer work at the hospital. Dr. Clemens had already agreed to provide testimony about his interaction with Emma and his reliability as a volunteer. Ruth Hendricks was preparing a statement about his character and judgment. Father Mackenzie from the Cornerstone Mission had offered to speak about Henry's commitment to helping vulnerable people. What about Your references? Henry asked. Sarah's expression tightened slightly. That's more complicated. Most of my professional contacts are in Colorado, and my personal life has been... She paused, choosing her words carefully. Focused on work rather than relationships. There's been a lot of moving around, a lot of starting over. Henry recognized the pattern. Sarah had inherited his tendency to use work as a refuge from complicated emotions, but where his career had provided stability and community connections, hers had led to geographic instability and professional isolation. Social work was demanding and emotionally draining, and Sarah had been carrying the additional weight of searching for Emma while managing her regular caseload. You've been running from something, Henry said quietly, the same way I've been running from our relationship. Sarah looked up from her laptop, and Henry saw his own recognition reflected in her eyes. I've been running from the idea that I might fail the people I care about, the same way I felt like you failed me. The honesty in her statement hit Henry like a physical blow. He had known intellectually that his work schedule and emotional distance had affected Sarah, but hearing it stated so directly forced him to confront the full impact of his choices. I did fail you, he said. Not because I didn't love you, but because I didn't know how to show love in ways you could understand. Your mother was the translator between us, and when she got sick... Henry stopped, the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever he thought about Margaret's final months. When she got sick, you disappeared into work even more than usual, Sarah finished. The sicker she got, the more emergencies you seemed to have to respond to. Henry nodded, remembering those months when Margaret's cancer had progressed despite treatment, when the house had filled with medical equipment and visiting nurses and the kind of careful quiet that comes when everyone is trying not to acknowledge. What they all know is coming. I didn't know how to watch her die, he admitted, so I ran toward other people's crises instead of staying with our own. Sarah reached across the table and touched his hand, the first physical contact they had shared in 3 years. I understand that now, but at the time, it felt like you were choosing strangers over your own family. I was, Henry said simply, and I lost both of you because of it. They worked in companionable silence for a while, building documentation of their individual capabilities and their potential as co-guardians. Henry's files contained commendations from his paramedic service, volunteer evaluations from the hospital, financial records showing his stable retirement income, and the house that was paid off and suitable for raising a child. Sarah's documentation was more complex but equally compelling. Her master's degree in social work, her state licensing, employment records from 3 different agencies where she had specialized in foster care and family preservation. Her nomadic career pattern looked like instability on paper, but Henry could see that she had been searching for something, a place where she could make a difference, a role that would fulfill the need to help that she had inherited from both. Her parents. I never wanted to be a paramedic, Henry said, breaking the comfortable quiet. When I was young, I wanted to be a teacher. High school history, maybe coach baseball. Sarah looked up in surprise. I never knew that. Your mother knew. She's the one who encouraged me to pursue emergency medicine instead, said I had the temperament for crisis response, the ability to stay calm when other people were falling apart. Henry sorted through a stack of performance evaluations, remembering the younger man who had believed that helping strangers was the same thing as helping family. She was right about my capabilities, but wrong about what it would cost. Mum never told me you wanted to teach. There were a lot of things your mother never told you because she was trying to protect both of us from hard truths we weren't ready to face. Henry found what he was looking for, a letter from the County Emergency Services Director praising his commitment to training new paramedics and his mentorship of younger staff. She knew that I used work to avoid dealing with emotions I didn't understand. She also knew that you needed more emotional availability than I was capable of providing at the time. Sarah saved her work and closed the laptop, giving Henry her full attention. Dad, are you saying that you think you're too old? or too emotionally unavailable to help raise Emma? Henry considered the question seriously. At 67, he had energy and health that many men his age lacked. His retirement was financially secure, his house was suitable for a child, and his volunteer work at the hospital had reminded him that he still had valuable skills to offer. But more importantly, his relationship with Emma had awakened something in him that he had thought was permanently damaged by years of emotional isolation. "I'm saying that I spent 38 years learning how to respond to other people's emergencies," he said finally. "But Emma isn't an emergency. She's family, and I want to learn how to be present for family in ways I never managed before." Sarah's eyes filled with tears that she didn't try to hide. "Dad, I want to learn that too. I want us to figure out how to be a family together." The conversation was interrupted by a phone call from Dr. Amanda Torres, the child psychologist who had been working with Emma since her arrival at the hospital. She wanted to discuss Emma's progress and her recommendations for the custody hearing. "Emma has made remarkable progress in the past week," Dr. Torres explained during their afternoon meeting at the hospital. "Her selective mutism has largely resolved, and she's beginning to process the trauma of losing her grandfather and the months of homelessness. However, she's also developed strong attachment to both of you, and any significant disruption to those relationships could cause regression." Henry watched through the conference room window as Emma played in the hospital's small family lounge with Scout, who had been officially registered as her therapy animal. The transformation in both of them was remarkable. Emma was more animated and talkative, while Scout seemed more relaxed, as if he could finally share the responsibility of protecting her. "What's your recommendation for the custody arrangement?" Sarah asked. Dr. Torres consulted her notes. "Ideally, Emma would remain in an environment where she feels safe and supported, while gradually rebuilding her sense of security and family connection. The bond she's formed with your father represents significant progress, but she also needs the stability that comes from having a primary guardian who can make long-term commitments to her care." "So, she needs both of us," Henry said. "I believe she does. Your father provides continuity with her recovery process and a sense of security based on his consistent presence during her hospitalization. You provide the legal standing and professional knowledge necessary to navigate the systems she'll encounter as she integrates back into normal childhood activities, school, medical care, social services." Sarah made notes on her legal pad, and Henry could see her thinking through the practical implications. "What about the geographical challenges? I live in Colorado, Dad lives here in Nebraska. Emma's established medical care is here, but my job and housing are in Colorado." Dr. Torres leaned forward slightly. "That's something you'll need to work out as a family, but from Emma's psychological perspective, stability of location and relationships matters more than specific geography. She's already experienced multiple traumatic disruptions. What she needs now is consistency and the assurance that the people she's beginning to trust won't disappear." Henry found himself thinking about the conversation he and Sarah had been avoiding since her arrival. "What if you move back to Nebraska, at least temporarily, while Emma adjusts?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Henry could see her weighing options that involved more than just geography. "I'd need to find work here. Social work positions in rural areas don't pay as well as urban jobs, and I have student loans, credit, card debt from all the traveling I did looking for Emma. You could stay with me," Henry offered. "The house is big enough, and it might be good for Emma to have both of us there while she settles in." The suggestion hung in the air between them, carrying implications that went beyond practical arrangements. Henry was proposing that they rebuild their relationship while co-parenting Emma, that they become the family that they had never quite managed to be when Sarah was growing up. "Dad, are you sure about that? We haven't lived in the same house for over 20 years, and we haven't even been speaking for the past 3 years. Henry thought about the patterns that had shaped their family, his tendency to retreat into work when emotions became complicated, Sarah's learned response of not depending on him to be consistently available, the way both of them had used geographical and emotional distance to avoid dealing with their unfinished business. I'm sure that Emma needs stability more than we need to protect ourselves from difficult conversations, he said finally. And I'm sure that I don't want to spend whatever years I have left wondering what might have happened if we'd been brave enough to try being a real family. Dr. Torres smiled at the exchange. From a therapeutic perspective, Emma would benefit enormously from seeing two adults she cares about working together to create a stable, loving home. Children who have experienced trauma often struggle with trust and attachment. Watching you two rebuild your relationship while maintaining your commitment to her would provide powerful modeling for how relationships can heal and grow. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of preparation that felt like cramming for the most important exam of their lives. Henry arranged for character witnesses to testify about his stability and caregiving abilities. Sarah contacted her former supervisors and professors to provide professional references. Together, they prepared Emma for the court appearance, explaining what would happen and reassuring her that the judge was simply making sure she would be safe and loved. Emma's response to the news about the custody hearing was characteristically direct. "Will Scout come with us?" she asked during one of their preparation conversations. "Scout will go wherever you go," Henry assured her. "He's your family, just like Aunt Jennifer and I are your family." "Will you and Aunt Jennifer live together so I can have both of you?" The question was asked with the matter-of-fact tone that children use when they're testing the stability of the adult world around them. Emma had learned not to take promises for granted, but she was also beginning to hope that this new family configuration might be permanent. "We're going to try," Sarah said carefully. "There will be a lot of changes and adjustments, but we want to make sure you feel safe and loved no matter what." "Good," Emma said with satisfaction. "Grandpa Marcus always said that families take care of each other even when it's hard." Thursday evening, the night before the hearing, Henry found himself unable to sleep. He walked through his house in the pre-dawn darkness, seeing it through Emma's eyes, the guest bedroom that could become her room, the backyard where Scout could run safely, the kitchen table where they could sit together for meals and homework, and the thousands of small conversations that make up family life. He thought about Margaret, wishing she could see how their story was continuing in ways they never could have imagined. She would have loved Emma instantly, would have embraced Sarah's return with the grace that had always made difficult things seem manageable. Margaret had believed in second chances and the power of love to heal old wounds. This opportunity to become Emma's guardian felt like Margaret's influence reaching across the years to give them all another chance to get family right. Sarah appeared in the kitchen doorway, also unable to sleep. She made coffee while Henry scrambled eggs, and they sat together in the comfortable silence of people preparing for something that would change their lives forever. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Sarah said, "I want you to know that I'm grateful for you finding Emma, for you taking care of her, for giving us a chance to be a family again." Henry reached across the table and took her hand. "Whatever happens. Tomorrow we're going to face it together. All of us, you, me, Emma, and Scout." As the sun rose over Millbrook, casting long shadows across the quiet streets, Henry felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the absolute certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. At 67, he had finally learned the difference between responding to crisis and building something lasting. Emma's future, their future as a family, would be decided in a courtroom in less than 6 hours. But Henry was no longer afraid of the outcome, because he knew that whatever the judge decided, they had already become something that couldn't be undone by legal documents or bureaucratic procedures. They had become a family, bound together by choice and commitment, rather than just biology and circumstance. The family court hearing began at 9 o'clock sharp on a Friday morning that felt like the fulcrum upon which 3 lives would tip toward either separation or unity. Judge Patricia Brennan presided from behind a bench that managed to look both authoritative and approachable, her grey hair pulled back in a style that suggested practicality over formality. Emma sat between Henry and Sarah in the front row of the small courtroom, wearing a new dress that Ruth had helped pick out during a shopping trip that had felt more like a family outing than a legal preparation. Scout lay at Emma's feet, his therapy animal certification displayed on his bright red vest, his calm presence a steadying influence on everyone in the room. Monica Rivera presented the state's position first, outlining the circumstances that had brought Emma into the system and the requirements for determining her permanent placement. Her presentation was thorough and professional, but Henry could hear the underlying advocacy in her voice. She had seen too many children bounced between temporary placements, and she clearly hoped that this case would end differently. "Your Honor," Monica said, consulting her notes, "Emma Thompson has been through significant trauma, including the loss of her parents in 2022, the death of her grandfather and primary caregiver in April of this year, and 6 months of homelessness. That ended only when she was brought to Millbrook General Hospital by her grandfather's service dog." Judge Brennan studied the file in front of her, occasionally looking up to observe Emma's interaction with Henry and Sarah. "Ms. Rivera, what is the state's recommendation for Emma's placement?" The state supports family placement with Jennifer Morrison, Emma's biological aunt, who has the legal standing and professional qualifications to serve as guardian. However, we also recognize the significant bond that Emma has formed with Henry Morrison during her recovery, and we believe that some form of ongoing relationship would be beneficial to the child's well-being. Sarah stood when called to present her case. She had prepared meticulously, but Henry could see the slight tremor in her hands as she approached the witness stand. This wasn't just a professional presentation. It was a daughter and aunt fighting for the right to protect someone she loved. "Your Honor, I am Emma's maternal aunt and a licensed social worker with 12 years of experience in child welfare services. I have been searching for Emma since my former brother-in-law's death in April, working with multiple agencies to try to locate her and ensure her safety." Judge Brennan consulted her notes. "Ms. Morrison, why weren't you listed as Emma's guardian in her grandfather's will or emergency contact information?" Sarah's voice was steady, but carried the weight of months of frustration with bureaucratic systems. "Marcus Thompson and I were in the process of working out arrangements for Emma's care. He was concerned about his health and wanted to ensure she would be cared for by family if something happened to him. Unfortunately, he died suddenly before we could formalize those arrangements." "And what is your current living situation?" "I am prepared to relocate to Nebraska to provide stability for Emma. My father has offered to share guardianship responsibilities, and I believe that arrangement would serve Emma's best interests by providing both family connection and continuity of care." When Henry was called to testify, he felt the weight of 67 years of experience distilling into this single moment. Everything he had learned about service, family, and responsibility would be tested by his ability to convince a judge that he could provide what Emma needed. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Brennan said, "you've been volunteering at the hospital where Emma was brought for treatment. Tell me about your relationship with her." Henry looked across the courtroom at Emma, who was watching the proceedings with the serious attention of someone who understood that her future was being decided. "Your Honor, Emma arrived at the hospital as Jane Doe, a child with no identification, no family, no official existence. But she was clearly loved. Someone had taught her to be kind, to trust carefully, to take care of the beings who depended on her." He paused, finding his words. "I've spent my career responding to other people's emergencies, but Emma wasn't an emergency to me. She was family before I even knew we were related. She needed someone to see her as a person rather than a case, and I needed to learn how to be present for family in ways I hadn't managed before. Judge Brennan leaned forward slightly. Mr. Morrison, you're 67 years old. Are you prepared for the physical and emotional demands of raising a traumatized 6-year-old? Henry had anticipated this question, but the answer came from his heart rather than his preparation. Your Honor, I've never been more prepared for anything in my life. Emma has already taught me things about courage and resilience that I never learned in 3 decades of emergency medicine. She survived 6 months of homelessness with only a dog for protection. She carried a drawing of her lost family through circumstances that would break most adults. She chose to trust me with her story when she could have remained silent. He gestured toward Emma, who was now watching him with complete attention. I'm not asking to raise her because I think I can teach her about life. I'm asking because I know she can teach me about what really matters. The courtroom was quiet, except for the soft sound of Emma whispering something to Scout, whose tail moved once in response. Judge Brennan made notes on her legal pad, her expression thoughtful but unreadable. I'd like to hear from Emma herself, the judge said, and Henry felt his breath catch. They had prepared Emma for this possibility, but actually facing it felt different than discussing it hypothetically. Emma stood up with the kind of careful dignity that Henry had come to recognize as her way of facing difficult situations. She walked to the witness stand, holding the drawing that had become her most treasured possession, Scout, following closely. Beside her, Judge Brennan adjusted the microphone to Emma's height and spoke with the gentle authority that came from years of working with children in traumatic circumstances. Hello, Emma. I'm Judge Brennan. I understand you have something you'd like to show me. Emma nodded and carefully unfolded her drawing, smoothing it against the wooden rail of the witness stand. This is my family, she said, her voice clear and steady. Grandpa Marcus and Scout and me, we lived in a house with flowers, and Grandpa Marcus taught me how to take care of things. Judge Brennan studied the drawing with the kind of attention that recognized its significance. It's a beautiful picture, Emma. Can you tell me what happened after your grandfather died? Emma's fingers traced the stick figure of Marcus, and Henry could see her gathering the courage to speak about experiences that no child should have to endure. The ladies came to take me away from Scout, but I didn't want to go. Scout is my family too, so we left before they could separate us. That must have been very scary, living outside with just Scout to take care of you. Scout knew how to find food and safe places to sleep. He taught me how to stay warm and how to hide when people might be dangerous. But when I got sick, he knew I needed more help than he could give me. Judge Brennan leaned forward slightly, her expression gentle but focused. Emma, Scout brought you to the hospital where you met Mr. Morrison and were reunited with your aunt. Jennifer, how do you feel about them? Emma looked across the courtroom at Henry and Sarah, and Henry saw something in her expression that made his chest tight with hope and fear. Grandpa Henry takes care of me like Grandpa Marcus did. He reads to me and sits with me when I can't sleep, and he makes sure Scout can stay with me. Aunt Jennifer loves me like Mama used to, before the car accident. The simple honesty of her statement carried more weight than any legal argument could have. This was a child who had learned to evaluate adults based on their actions rather than their promises, and she had found both Henry and Sarah worthy of her trust. Emma, if you could choose where to live and who would take care of you, what would you want? Emma looked down at her drawing, then back at the judge with the kind of direct gaze that suggested she had given this question serious consideration. I want to live with Grandpa Henry and Aunt Jennifer and Scout, all of us together in the same house like a real family. She paused, then added with the wisdom of someone who had learned that good things could disappear without warning, I want them to promise that they won't leave me, even if taking care of me gets hard. Judge Brennan made notes on her legal pad, then looked directly at Henry and Sarah. I'm going to ask both of you to join Emma at the witness stand. This is an unusual proceeding, but this is an unusual case. Henry and Sarah approached the bench together, flanking Emma, who remained standing between them. Scout positioned himself where he could see all three of them, his alert posture indicating that he understood the significance of this moment. "Mr. Morrison and Ms. Morrison," Judge Brennan said, "Emma has asked for a promise that you won't leave her even if caring for her becomes difficult. Are you prepared to make that commitment?" Henry felt the weight of every promise he had ever broken, every time he had chosen work over family, every moment he had failed to be present when presence mattered most. But he also felt the strength that came from finally understanding what he was meant to do with the years he had left. "Your Honor, I promise Emma that I will be here for as long as she needs me, through whatever challenges we face together. I will be the grandfather she deserves, and I will make sure she always knows she's loved and wanted." Sarah's voice was thick with emotion when she spoke. "I promise Emma that I will protect her and advocate for her, and love her unconditionally. I will be the family she can count on, and I will never let her feel abandoned or alone again." Emma looked up at both of them, then reached out and took their hands. "I promise to be a good family member too," she said solemnly. "I promise to trust you and tell you when I'm scared and help take care of Scout." Judge Brennan smiled, the first time her formal demeanor had cracked during the entire proceeding. "Emma, I think you're already keeping that promise beautifully." She consulted her notes one final time, then looked up with the expression of someone who had reached a decision that felt both legally sound and morally right. "In the matter of Emma Thompson's guardianship, this court grants joint custody to Jennifer Morrison and Henry Morrison, with Jennifer Morrison designated as primary guardian for legal purposes, and Henry Morrison designated as co-guardian with full caregiving authority." The gavel came down with a sound that felt like a door opening rather than closing, and Henry realized that for the first time in 3 years, he wasn't thinking about what he had lost. He was thinking about what they had all found together, a family built on choice and commitment rather than just blood and circumstance. 6 months after Scout carried Emma through the doors of Millbrook General Hospital, Henry Morrison stood in his kitchen watching his granddaughter help Sarah pack lunch for what had become their traditional Saturday picnic in Riverside Park. The scene was so ordinary, Emma carefully arranging sandwiches in a basket while Scout waited hopefully for dropped crumbs, that Henry sometimes had to remind himself how miraculous ordinary had become. Emma was thriving in ways that continued. To surprise her therapist, Dr. Torres, she had started first grade at Millbrook Elementary in January, where her teacher, Mrs. Patterson's niece Claire, had worked patiently to help her adjust to classroom routines and social interactions with other children. The selective mutism that had marked her early days at the hospital was now just a memory, replaced by the natural chattiness of a 7-year-old who felt safe enough to share her thoughts and questions freely. "Grandpa Henry, do you think Scout remembers living with Grandpa Marcus?" Emma asked, offering the dog a small piece of cheese that he accepted with gentle dignity. "I think Scout remembers everything important," Henry said, watching the interaction between girl and dog that still filled him with wonder. "Just like you do. But I also think he's happy about the new memories you're making together." Sarah appeared from the guest bedroom that had officially become her room 3 months earlier, when she had accepted a position with the county social services department. The job paid less than her previous work in Colorado, but it allowed her to stay in Millbrook and provided the kind of meaningful work that had drawn her to social work in the first place. "Ready for our picnic?" she asked, and Henry marveled at how natural the question sounded, how seamlessly they had created routines that felt like they had existed for years rather than months. The transformation in their family had been gradual but profound. Henry had learned to be present in ways that his younger self wouldn't have recognized. Sitting through Emma's bedtime stories, even when his volunteer shift at the hospital had been exhausting, attending school conferences and parent meetings, simply being available for the hundreds of small moments that made up childhood. Sarah had discovered that the skills she had developed helping other people's families could be applied to healing her own relationship with her father. The professional communication techniques she used in her work had given her vocabulary for expressing needs and setting boundaries, while Henry's newfound emotional availability had created space for conversations they had never managed before. But it was Emma who had taught them both the most important lessons about family. Her resilience had shown them that love could survive devastating loss, while her willingness to trust again had demonstrated that relationships could be rebuilt even after profound betrayal or abandonment. At the park, they spread their blanket, in the same spot where Henry had brought Emma during her first week out of the hospital, when she was still pale and fragile and Scout was still hyper-vigilant about potential threats. Now Emma ran freely while Scout jogged beside her with the relaxed gait of a dog who no longer carried the weight of sole responsibility for her safety. "I got a letter from Mrs. Kowalski yesterday," Sarah said, settling beside Henry on the blanket. "Marcus's neighbor. She's been following Emma's story through the Veterans Organization newsletter." Henry remembered Mrs. Kowalski from his initial investigation, the elderly woman who had blamed herself for Emma and Scout's disappearance. "How is she doing?" "Better," she said, knowing that Emma is safe and loved has helped her forgive herself for what happened. She sent a photo album that Marcus had made of Emma's first year with him after her parents died. Henry watched Emma showing Scout how to balance on a fallen log, their communication a mixture of words and gestures that spoke to months of shared understanding. "Does Emma want to see the photos? She's been looking through them all week. I think she's ready to remember the good times without being overwhelmed by the loss." Dr. Torres had warned them that Emma's healing wouldn't be linear, that anniversaries and transitions might trigger temporary regressions, that the trauma of her early losses would always be part of her story. But she had also marveled at Emma's ability to integrate her difficult experiences into a coherent narrative of survival and resilience. "She's teaching a masterclass in post-traumatic growth," Dr. Torres had said during their last session. "Most adults never learn what Emma has figured out at 7, that you can honor what you've lost while still embracing what you've found." As the afternoon wore on, Henry found himself thinking about the drawing that had started everything. The simple picture of a house with flowers, stick figures representing a family, and a dog caught in mid-run. Emma had created a new drawing the week before, showing the same house but with additional figures. Henry reading in a chair by the window, Sarah working in the garden, Emma and Scout playing in the yard. "Family," she had said when she showed him the new artwork. Complete family. The Veterans Organization had invited Henry to speak at their annual banquet about Scout's heroic actions and Emma's survival story. He had accepted, understanding that their experience might provide hope for other veterans dealing with loss and transition, but he had insisted that Emma and Scout be recognized as the real heroes, she for her courage in trusting them to rebuild her world, and Scout for his unwavering dedication to keeping her safe until help could arrive. As they packed up their picnic and headed home, Henry realized that this was what Margaret had always tried to teach him, that the most important emergencies weren't the dramatic crises that brought sirens and adrenaline, but the quiet daily work of showing up consistently for the people who needed you. Emma skipped ahead with Scout, her laughter carrying across the park like a promise that joy could survive anything life might bring. Sarah walked beside Henry, occasionally bumping his shoulder in the affectionate way that had developed between them as they learned to be father and daughter again. At 67, Henry had finally discovered his true calling, not as someone who responded to other people's crises, but as someone who helped create the kind of stability that prevented crises from happening in the first place. He was a grandfather, a father, a family member who could be counted on to be present for all the ordinary moments that turned out to be the most extraordinary of all. Behind them, the autumn sun cast long shadows across the empty park, but ahead of them, the lights of home were already beginning to shine through the gathering dusk.